Hello and welcome to another episode of Tour de Core. And Tour de Core, of course, is this series where we take a deeper dive into WordPress core. So far, the primary focus has been around Gutenberg, which on its own is not part of WordPress core just yet. But I believe that it's a significant enough game changer that I devoted about 13 episodes already, 12 to 13 episodes, specifically talking about and exploring Gutenberg. Now, I believe since we have covered a whole lot of information about Gutenberg, from what are blocks, how to create blocks, what are dynamic blocks, how you can integrate the REST API with Gutenberg, and a whole lot of other things, I believe that it's time to now shift the focus back into WordPress core itself. And today, I want to talk to you about one particular skill that I believe is probably the best skill that I have in my skill set that turned me into the developer that I am today. And it all started with one advice, and it was very simple. Essentially, back in the day when I was still learning the ropes of WordPress and development in general, I used to work at a company where my primary job was turning HTML, static HTML, into WordPress sites. And luckily I had some great colleagues there that guided me along my journey and helped me whenever I had questions that I couldn't figure out on my own. And one of those days, one of those questions was, how do I use a WordPress function to do what I needed to do to produce the HTML that I needed to produce? And in particular, the situation was something along the lines of, I had a structure for a menu, and let's say it was something along the lines of this. And inside, I have my UL, and then let's say I have 5 items in my menu. So at that point I already knew that I can just use WP nav menu in order to render a menu on a front end, from the back end to the front end. So I knew about that function, and I knew that I can say I want a certain class for the wrapping element and I want a certain ID, or the ID was automatically generated, but I didn't know how to add something custom. In this case I had this, for example, this data drop down attribute, which I didn't know how to add in there. And so my colleague, when I asked him how to do that, he said, well, it's very simple, just look up the function, find it in the source code and see what it does. And so we did just that. And we found the following. First of all, in the description of usually most WordPress functions, there is a pretty good description in the PHP doc block for that particular function of what kind of parameters it takes, what it returns, and so on. But also at the beginning we can see the defaults that are being set up. And so in particular what stands out, I guess it wasn't quite like that as I remember it, but what stands out is that there's this items wrap. So I guess my situation was maybe more along the lines of this, instead of the other way around, where I had to change the UL a little bit, but I didn't know exactly how. And so I saw we have items wrap, and that, from the name of the parameter, seems like that is how WordPress is going to wrap the top level items of the menu. And then, in fact, if we do look down, further down, that we're going to figure out that that's what happens. So we can see that the nav menu is generated by replacing the item strap with the corresponding HTML that needs to go in those placeholders. And I would like to say that this particular event changed the way that I developed in the future, because after that I started doing this more and more often. Because in certain situations I found that it's easier to just jump in the source code than it is to look it up on Google. You know, sometimes the obscure things that we face are not easily findable. Like, there's so few people that have run into that situation, and even less of them have actually documented it. And so it's not always likely that we're going to find a solution about a particular problem. And yeah, from there on, anytime I wasn't sure about something, I would take a look at the source code of WordPress and I would try and figure out what is going on. So let me explain why I think this is beneficial, because it might not be immediately obvious. So number one, obviously this is going to help you learn WordPress better. Like, you're going to be able to understand WordPress better, how it functions, its internals, and so on. I believe, and let me verify that claim real quick. Okay, maybe I cannot find it that quickly, but I believe that developing WordPress to the state where it is today was estimated to somewhere around 150 man years. So that is, you know, somebody working full-time every day for 150 years. And that's pretty mind-blowing. And again, I could be wrong on this fact. I would have to double check it, but I believe it was something along those lines. And so you're going to say, but you know, how am I going to learn WordPress very deeply, and how am I going to understand it fully? I can't just possibly sit down and read for all WordPress core at once. And I believe that's the case. I mean, certainly you can do it, but I'm not 100% sure what the benefits will be and how much of that you're going to remember by the time you finish. So using this approach of reading through the source code of WordPress when you are in a certain situation and reading only the context that you need is going to let you learn bit by bit parts of WordPress core. And I think that's super helpful, because then you're going to be able to A, reach to solutions faster, and B, you're going to be able to know how WordPress functions and therefore plan better according to WordPress. And of course, this doesn't apply just to WordPress. This can apply to anything that you're using, a specific plugin. It could be a framework. It could be a completely different CMS than WordPress. It could be even in a different language. It doesn't have to be just PHP. You can apply this anywhere. Which brings me to my second point, which is, if you do this often and you get used to it, eventually you're going to be able to jump into unknown code bases much more quickly. For example, you start a new job and that company where you're starting to work has this major project they're gonna have to be working on. Practicing this every day for a little bit, you know, once or twice a day, might make the difference between you onboarding and getting used to this huge code base that you don't know by a huge margin. It can make a difference, you know, from taking a month to taking a couple of months. And I believe that's super helpful. And now finally, my last point about why this is beneficial is that if you practice this long enough, at least in my case, I would like to say I have some sort of a process in the back of my mind that helps me when I code. So it helps me think critically of the code that I'm writing, and it helps me to catch certain issues before they occur. And a good example of this would be if we have some PHP code. And let's say we have a for loop of some sort, right? And then in there we have a condition where we check if some ID equals the ID in one of the items, then we're going to break. Right? So something like that, but for some reason something doesn't quite work. Maybe I'm using strict type checking and this is an integer and this is a string, you know. And if, for example, just being quick and not paying a lot of attention, I try to do something like, you know, taking a look, do we have an item here? You know, I'm guessing most everyone that is a developer and has experience with writing, you know, some sort of PHP, and not even PHP, this is applicable to other languages, will be able to tell me, hey, that's not going to work. You know, this will never ever get called because it's after the break. And that's a super simplified example of that. But as I write code, I'm able to, you know, think critically about all the different points where my code branches. And I'm able to sort of execute it in my head and think about where potential issues could be with that particular code. And yeah, so as you keep doing that, you're gonna find it helpful. A lot of times though, I'm personally more of the type where I just type and then I try to see if it works, and if it doesn't work, then I fix it. But you know, being able to catch some things that are not necessarily that easy to debug later on is a good quality, I think. And yeah, so this is what I want to try and convey through maybe a couple of episodes of Tour de Core. And I'm going to be doing this by giving specific scenarios and showing the solution, which comes from searching through WordPress core itself. And with that said, you've probably, if you've watched some of the Tour de Core episodes already, you've probably seen me doing this quite a few times. I have done this in order to figure out how certain blocks from Gutenberg are created so that I can use similar code and similar logic. I have done it to look up stuff in Gutenberg itself on the PHP side of things. And you're probably gonna see me doing this in the future streams, even if it's not necessarily the topic of the stream, because that's just how I work. And like I said, I believe this is a super helpful skill, and I hope that it's gonna help you be more confident about tinkering with WordPress core. So exploring it, maybe changing it for a little bit while you're debugging something, and so on. And now the second example I would like to talk about, which I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to illustrate here. I was working on a project where if you hit a certain URL, let's say my import, and then you give it an ID of some external ID, it would make a request to an API, from, you know, some external API. And it would do that, and it would pull information about that particular object, and it would save it in the WordPress database as a post with some custom information about it, like post meta, terms, and so on. And this used to work just fine until one day it stops working just fine, and all it does is just creates posts. So in my code, you know, I'm doing I'm creating my post object, you know, I'm giving it a post title, post content, and then I'm saying post ID equals WP insert post. And then further down the line, I will do update post meta with the post ID. And by the way, I will do, so if this is WP error, then do some logic and exit, right? And then further down the line, I will update the post meta. And then I will assign the terms and so on and so forth. And what happened one day is that the post will get created. So I would have a post named some title with some content, but it wouldn't have any of the additional information. I wouldn't have any of the post meta, I wouldn't have any of the terms, and so on. It just stopped working out of a sudden. And my first guess was that it probably had something to do with WP insert post, right? Because that's where it fails. So WP insert post works, but then after that nothing else happens. So first of all, we know that it's not a WP error, the post ID. Well, because a WP error would be returned if the post was not created in the database. So then I said, okay, well, let's find WP insert post and let's see what happens in there. And from experience, I already know kind of what happens, and I had a rough idea what the problem was, but for the sake of example, I'm going to show you exactly what is going on in there. So WP insert post initializes an array of default values and then merges them together with the data that you send. Then it sanitizes the data. So nothing huge so far. It checks if you do have an ID, and if you have an ID, it calls, well, first it sees if there is a post like that at all, and if there isn't, it's gonna give you a WP error, or return 0. And then further down the line, what it does, well, it needs the previous status as well so that it can trigger some actions. But eventually what it does is it should call WP update post, right? Somewhere down the line. Yeah, so if it's an update, it calls pre-post. Oh, hold on a second. WP update post. So we have WP update post. Oh, okay. So it's the other way around. If you call WP update post, it will call WP insert post. That makes sense. So anyway, coming back to WP insert post, it does a lot of stuff which we don't really care about. What we care about is to see where our post is being actually inserted into the database. And as we keep looking, we eventually get to a post. Okay, so this is where it updates it. There, okay, yeah, so it inserts the post into the post table. Then it gets the ID, and if the insert failed, it's going to throw a WP error or return 0. So okay, I think to myself, okay, it's not here, obviously, the insert is working just fine. So I will keep going, and if you know WordPress, you know that the way that you can hook into WordPress functionality is by using filters or actions. And so the logical thing now would be to look for either a do action call or apply filters call, or the corresponding apply filter reference array or do action reference array, as in this function right here. And so we can keep going through the code and looking for the clue, and eventually we do get to do actions, but this is for attachments, which I'm not inserting an attachment post, therefore this is not what I'm interested in. We get to update, where edit post is called as well as post updated. Then we see, here we go, save post with the post type or just save post, and that will be insert post. And now this is more based on my personal experience. Most plugins are probably going to use save post. Newer plugins might use save post with the post type, but it also depends on how these plugins work. For example, if a post only registers its own post type and it deals only with its own post type, then it's more likely that it's going to use save post underscore the post type name. Whereas a plugin that deals with all sorts of post types is more likely to use save post. And so I say, okay, well, how do we figure out where the problem is? And this is how I do it. So I grab the name of my hook, so save post in this case, and just to make it easier and faster, I'm going to go into my theme and I'm going to do the following. I'm going to take a look, and everyone that is a fan of Xdebug, look away. Because this is not pretty. Saying that, I'm just not a huge fan of using the debugger because I haven't gotten used to it much, but I do recommend to anyone that hasn't tried using a debugger yet to do that, because you might find it much more powerful than what you can do with, you know, this archaic style of debugging, either with var_dump or error walk calls, you know, you name it. Just not my cup of tea. Sometimes I use it, but most of the time I just find it easier to do this and be done with it. So, like I said, we're going to take a look at what we have in the filters. So, if you don't know this, WordPress has a global variable called filter. And this used to be an array, but now it's an object, I believe, but it still has array access. It implements array access, so you can kind of use it like an array. And that is where WordPress stores all of the information about which hook, I guess which callbacks are attached to which filters or hooks. Although technically they are kind of the same, at least there's no difference in this array. So yeah, and you'll see in a second what the structure of this array looks like, more or less. Okay, so I say, okay, well, let's look at what is inside of save post. And in here, I would expect to see an array with indexes for the priority, so 0, 10, so on, and then the corresponding callback that has been registered to that priority. And what we see here, oh, okay, let's put an exit in here so that we can actually see it. In this case, we see ... yeah, Xdebug is configured to hide some of the stuff. Anyway, all we can see is that we have that this is an object of type hook. So an instance of the WP hook class, and it has callbacks, and in there it has some elements. Let's actually cast to an array, since I believe this will no. Okay, let's look at the callbacks in particular. Oh, okay, no. There we go. So we have an array with indexes, and usually integer indexes, and inside of each index we have an array with one or more callbacks. So in this case we can see that at priority 10 we have 2 callbacks, so delete, get calendar cache, and then something else, save post. As you can see, this is some strange hash looking thing. What it is that WordPress creates a unique identifier for a callback if you give it an array with an object and a method, because that's how WordPress serializes it, so that later on you can call back whatever you hooked in there. So actually I take that back. WordPress serializes that more, I believe, more in order to differentiate between different instances of the same class. Yes, so it doesn't do it so that it can figure out which thing to call. That is inside of the function parameter. It does it in order so that you can attach filters to the same, you can attach the same function from different class instances. And maybe that's actually fully unique. I'm not 100% sure on that. So, like I said, I did that. And in my case, I had many more callbacks in here. But looking at the callbacks, I was able to look, okay, so what is the difference between all of those? Where does each one of them come from? And obviously, most of them came from plugins. But certain plugins, I kind of gave them, you know, a pass, because I know it's more than likely that it's not the problem is not coming from them. For example, if I see Yoast having a callback on save post, then I'm gonna be like, well, most likely it's not Yoast, because they would have fixed it by now, or somebody would have complained about it. Same with other tested plugins that I have used, or any plugins that I have used while developing the site. And so eliminating some of the plugins eventually come to a plugin which is something, I think it was something to share things on social media or something like that. Anyway, in their callback, I see, so they have a class. So they have a class and they have a function. They have a function like save post, and in here they say add action to save post this instance save post. And so I find this eventually, and I look in the function of save post, and in here they're calling some other class, something along like check authentication or something like that. Now I'm guessing that in my case the problem was that I was calling WP insert post from the front end context instead of backend context like WP admin or the admin Ajax. But what I hadn't checked off in that other class was essentially something like this. if if the nonce doesn't if the nonce is not valid, die. Yep, that's all they did. And maybe it wasn't specifically a nonce verification, but it was some sort of check. And mind you, this, because this was coming from yeah. Anyway, so if for some reason the verification doesn't work, just die. Stop doing whatever you're doing, doesn't matter. And I see they're thinking, you know, it's much easier to do that instead of to do everywhere where you use this call to do that. I can see it. It's more effort, especially if you use it in, you know, 50 places. But it was just a little bit lazy on their part, which is no fun. But yeah, so in that particular case, Googling would not have helped, you know, because what am I going to search? Maybe I'm going to search WP insert post doesn't work, or WP insert post returns, or something like that, you know. But the situation was stemming from an offending plugin, and my use case was probably rare enough that they haven't noticed it, and so probably nobody has complained about it on the internet and nobody has had a solution for it. So in that case, understanding how WordPress works and being able to look at first the code of WP insert post, and then looking for the actions that are for the callbacks that are attached to the save post action, I was able to nail down the problem, and I was able to solve it by doing the following. Which is not pretty at all. The problem with the way that callbacks are, well, the problem with doing this, add action, save post, array this, save post, is that if you do just this, there's no reference to your object anywhere else outside of your object itself. Like, if you're a developer and you decide to use this approach, please do something like this. Instead of just making it anonymous, because sometimes we are going to have, or other developers are going to have a legitimate reason to unhook some of your actions. And we're going to do it whether you do it like that or not. It's just gonna make a difference of how easy it is going to be to remove your action. So this function, which is not exactly what it was called, but this function essentially goes through all of the callbacks registered for, so I say, you know, from save post, remove my class, specifically save post, you know, and then I can say at priority 10 or whatever. It would loop through all the callbacks until it finds a match. So it finds an object that is an instance of my class, and the function, the method that is supposed to be called is save post. And then it would call remove action, because at that point it's going to have a reference to the particular object, and so WordPress will be able to remove it. But yeah, so that's how I solved that problem. And it was good to know how to read through the code and be able to understand how the code executes, specifically within the WordPress context, but then you can apply that anywhere else. With that being said, I think this is going to be a relatively short tour de corps today, but you can expect something similar to this. I'm going to collect some more examples so that I can show different situations, and it's not just, you know, this simple example. I'm going to try and find more odd situations of certain problems and how I find the solution by looking at WordPress core itself. If you have any feedback on this, if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll be more than happy to, and maybe I will look at your specific example and I'll provide the solution. And since of course this is tour de corps and it's live streaming, I promise I will not be doing any preparation before the stream, except for to pick which questions to use, because that's more fun, and that way you can see exactly how I debug a situation and how I figure it out, instead of me just following a script of how to do it. If you don't want to leave a comment, then feel free to join me again next Sunday. So on the 8th of April at the same time, 10 p.m. Bulgarian time or noon PST. And feel free to ask me your question then. If you have any suggestions on this sort of format, feel free to leave them down below. If you have any sort of suggestions about this stream, I'll be more than happy to hear those. And just 1 minute. I have a potential suggestion for next week. Okay, cool. Well, sounds good, and thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learn potentially to not be afraid to jump into WordPress core or any other source code for that matter. All the best. Have a great week next week, and I'll see you next time.